More to the point, how old are you, and are you a boy or a girl? It's not my fault. I just have to report the information as science finds it. If you're older, you're going to have a hard time losing body weight, or body fat. I guess it'd be a better statement there, more clear statement. And if you're a woman, I'm sorry, it's harder. Why? Because y'all have these hormone things that men don't have to deal with. Cyclically, you have them, in terms of ebb and flow of life. It's the big M word, when menopause happens, guess what happens to women's abilities to lose weight? It's very, very, very difficult to do. And the answer to the question, sometimes people will say, well, it's ridiculous that you're telling somebody to eat 1,000 calories a day. We're going down to where they lose weight, they lose fat. Why? Because without sticking them with needles and doing muscle biopsies and doing all the things that would be necessary to really gauge their health, there is one simple test that determines whether you are eating to excess or whether you are eating to insufficiency. And the answer is, unfortunately, what does the scale say? Or what does a hydrostatic weighing, what does a BOD-POD result, or what does a DEXA say? Body composition rules the answer to the questions that are kind of gate-kept here. So what are macronutrients? And I know this kind of sounds like basic information to you guys, but I want to make sure that as people look to these videos, that people reach out, that we have a very clear answer to those questions, right? What is a macronutrient? A macronutrient is the key to any dietary manipulation. And it doesn't matter what diet we're talking about. Whether we're talking about standard American diet, it's still basically the same macronutrients. Different ratios, different amounts, but it's still the same sort of thing. So I've left a little information here. These are very, I put approximately in here because the reality is, the answer to my question about whether all calories are the same is obviously no. Some contain, some grams of macronutrient contain more calories than others. But what's interesting is these are approximations, because as you look at the underlying substrate, if you look at the amino acid composition of a protein, you'll find that its calories per gram vary. So the body's trying to give us a heads up to answer the question that I asked a few minutes ago. Is carbohydrate a carbohydrate? Is a protein a protein? The answer is obviously not. And what's interesting is when, with regard to the answer to that question, what we found is that muscle building supplement companies have funded a lot of studies around amino acid quality, and you've got all sorts of assays and surveys and scores and rating systems to determine whether whey or casein is a better milk-based protein source. What do we think about egg white proteins? What do we think about, fill in the blanks? We've looked at those and we've answered those questions. Why? Because we like to lift weights and we buy supplements, and they have money and they invest in that research that gives us the answers to those questions. Nobody invests in the answer to the question about fats. It's just a reality of the statement. The last bullet point here is the most important point that I can make to you today. Macronutrients should always be calculated and tracked on a daily basis. I cannot tell you how many times I've tried to help someone, and I say, what are your macros? What are you eating in a given day? And when I ask that question, then the answer is, I don't know, I just eat till I'm not hungry. And you're laughing, seriously, you're laughing, and sometimes I find myself going, and I've gotten to the point where somebody say, then I can't help you. Is it harsh? Maybe a little, but is it true? Luis, you're fond of quoting from your business background, that which is not measured cannot be controlled. Yeah, absolutely, it can't be managed. And I would go a step forward, and that which is not managed cannot be controlled, or managed and manipulated. I guess it'd be, let's just continue the alliteration of M. That which is not managed cannot be manipulated. If you don't know the answer to the question, within a reasonable shout, how many grams of protein am I getting in a day, then I can't tell you whether that is sufficient, whether that is excess, or whether that is insufficient. If you don't know how many grams of fat you are getting in a day, then I can't help you. Even if you can tell me your goals to the nth degree, if you can say to me, I want to run a marathon in 6 months, and I say, how much fat are you able and willing to eat in a day? And you say, I don't know, I just eat till I'm not hungry anymore. That doesn't work. And if I say to you, well, how many grams of carbohydrate are you getting? And you say to me, well, I try and avoid foods that have sugar names in the label. And I'm like, well, what about seasonings? Well, I like a little bit of honey before I go for a run. Or, you know, and I've gotten all of these over the years, and they've been these messages, and I just, you know, I found myself turning into that Susan Powder lady from like 10 years ago, the Stop the Insanity woman. And I'm like, stop, if you'll just take a piece of paper and a pencil and write down some generalities about what it is that you're putting in your mouth on a daily basis, we can help. The ketogenic industry at large can help. But when we have people, well-meaning people, who forget that every statement that comes out of our mouth should be filtered through a lens of context of the individual, who make blanket statements and say, calories don't matter, I ask, to whom? Because they sure matter to me. You know, they'll say things like, you know, well, you know, we had the If It Fits Your Macros crowd who said, well, a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. And I would raise my hand and say, have you ever read a biology textbook? Have you ever read a biochemistry textbook? The answer to that question, no, they're not. And the sooner we get to the point where we can say, context drives the answer to all of this, the better we're going to be at helping individuals and helping ourselves to say, how do I get rid of fat? How do I get rid of fat in my body? How do I get rid of fat in the bodies of people that I care about? How do we get rid of all of these metabolic diseases that are out there? How do we get rid of diabetes in children, right? How do we get rid of, you know, and I'm not talking about type 1, some of the stuff that we've got other issues. We are diagnosing children with type 2 diabetes. Put down the Coke, that's a starting point. How do we then diet, you know, how do we deal with Alzheimer's? How do we deal with dementia? Well, then all of a sudden we're seeing studies come in because the veil has been removed from science, like I mentioned before, and what happens? All of a sudden people go, it's funny, these people that don't eat a lot of sugar, they don't develop Alzheimer's and dementia symptoms nearly to the extent that those who do. And so it then goes a step further and you say, but what's interesting is even if they've already started to show those signs, if we take carbohydrate out of their diet, what happens? They go a lot longer, and in some cases the symptoms themselves have been shown to be reversed. There's so much truth that what you put into your mouth is, I think, sometimes as important as what comes out of it. So we'll kind of dive in a little bit to the details here. So protein in a ketogenic diet. Protein is the building block for muscular growth. We've talked about that. If you don't eat sufficient protein, guess what's going to happen? You're not going to get big and swole. You're not. I mean, let's call it what it is. You know, but the reality is it's also involved in a whole lot more stuff, right? It's involved in the immune response. You get sick a lot, and everybody says, take vitamin E pill, or vitamin C, or whatever the vitamin is of the day, right? I think one of those companies, I think it was Airborne, got sued for making, you know, those claims. But, you know, it's interesting, the amino acids are the substrate from which these specific proteins are built. So the protein that you're consuming, that chicken, that steak, that piece of meat, guess what's happening to it? It gets broken down. And then guess what the body does with it? Among a host of other things we're going to touch on, it also rebuilds itself into immune-fighting mechanisms. And I'm trying to be very generic because I'm a nerd, and I know that I will spend 4 hours talking about immunoglobulin responses, and it's fascinating to me. Maybe a step further, we consider the enzymatic functions, right? What's an enzyme? It's a thing that makes a thing do a thing. I mean, let's distill it down. Enzymes are made of proteins which cause and facilitate a number of reactions in the body. Seriously, go do a research. I mean, seriously, go to Wikipedia and start researching protein-based enzymes, and you'll find hundreds and thousands of them. It's not very hard to find. Messenger protein to tell cells and tissues to do things. Well, we're familiar with a few of those, right? I mean, you look at it, insulin. That's an important one, especially in a ketogenic diet, right? Glucagon, our champion and our enemy, right? You know, some people will have you to believe insulin is the devil and glucagon is Michael the Archangel. I think the reality is neither is inherently bad or good. They are that they are. But those are the ones we're familiar with, right? Going a step further, oxytocin. We were talking earlier about the issues of ketogenic diets and reproductive health, right? Well, oxytocin's the thing that makes the baby come out of you, among a host of other things. Kind of an important thing. Otherwise, babies get big, and after a while, you probably would like that baby to come out of you. Usually around month 7, from what I've been told by a lot of women who are pregnant. You go a step further, right? Transport proteins, which take substances into the cells, are themselves protein-based. So when I say to you that protein is the king of all macronutrients, I don't mean in terms of how much of it you should be eating in a day. What I mean is, without any of these functions happening in your body, you are one dead individual. You will not be alive for very long if insulin nor glucagon can be manufactured and regulate blood glucose in your body, because that's their chief function. So how much is adequate? How much is excess? And what happens to excess protein? So if we start with the discussion point of how much is adequate, it's a really simple answer: enough. And that's kind of a blunt answer. I think that the reality is somewhere around 0.8 to maybe 1 gram per pound of lean body mass. It's the recommendations that we make in all of our official materials. But, you know, the question also becomes, how much is too little? Well, how much is your lean mass? Are you somebody that weighs 300 pounds and 200 pounds of you is bone and muscle tissue? Or are you somebody who weighs 300 pounds and 120 pounds of you is bone and muscle tissue? Because the answer then to how much protein is what would be considered adequate or sufficient, and how much would be excess, or more to the point, how much would be insufficient? You know, that again, what's that word, the C word, context? It's important. So again, how much is adequate? Context is the key. The answer to the question is how much is adequate in the lean individual, somebody like Luis? You know, the answer is about 0.8, 1 gram, roughly. In the obese, depends. How much of them is fat and how much of them is not fat? You don't really know the answer to that question until you've had body composition testing done. And here's the one that kind of throws a monkey wrench in it: in the underweight. What if we're trying to put mass on a person? It's not so much a problem in this country anymore, but you know, some of these starvation experiments, evidently Michael it is, I guess. But what do we have to do? What is the answer to this question? The answer to this question is probably that you are not only underweight in general, you probably don't have a whole lot of lean mass either. So the answer to the question becomes, do we go to 1.2 gram per pound of what currently is your lean body mass? Maybe. But there is a kind of a known entity or a known answer to that question. But one of the things that I want to be very clear about, protein is a fixed value in a ketogenic diet, a well-formulated ketogenic diet that really ought to say more clearly. The amount that you should eat per day is generally the amount you should eat per day. That is the very definition of a tautology, a statement that says nothing while saying something twice. We are absolutely in a world where your lean mass doesn't change all that frequently or all that drastically in a given window of time, with the exception of what we've jokingly called noob gains in the bro industry. Once you kind of exceed that point, guess what? Putting on muscle, it ain't easy. It just isn't. So how much should I eat? The same amount that you eat every day. And if you find that that's not sufficient to drive the performance because you have context and goals that are different from I want to look the same today as I do 6 months from now, make change. But don't make it an ad hoc thing, right? Where today I eat 300 grams of protein, tomorrow I eat 20. You know, Thursday I'm going to eat 75 because I've got to confuse the body. That's stupid. And I think this last point, maybe Luis can touch on this a little bit when his presentation time is up, but some variation around training and non-training days is acceptable and probably encouraged. There's a host of reasons for that I'm not going to bog down too far into the weeds on, but you know, one of the things that we wind up discussing ad nauseum, it seems like, is this: what happens if I eat too much protein? You explode. No, the short answer,